St. Petersburg, 1912. Tsar Nicholas Romanov, his wife Alexandra, and their son and heir Alexei in all their glory. Their 4 daughters, the Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. The Romanov dynasty had ruled Russia for 300 years. In another 6, it would all be over. Nicholas was the wrong man in the wrong place. A mild, awkward man whose country would be ravaged by war and revolution. His wife was detested by her subjects, thought to be a spy and a fool under the spell of a depraved madman. The Romanovs seemed oblivious to it all. Echoes of passion and tragedy still haunt their photographs, letters, and diaries.
Petitions and audiences without end. Saw Alex for 1 hour only. It is sad that my work takes so many hours which I would prefer to spend exclusively with Alex. I am so indescribably happy with her.
Never did I believe there could be such utter happiness in this world. Such a feeling of unity between 2 mortal beings.
But love did not conquer all. It blinded them to the fury that raged just outside their grand and glorious palaces. In the end, revolution would sweep Nicky, his wife Alex, and their 5 children away. Nicholas's first encounter with assassination came when he was only 12. In March 1881, his grandfather, Tsar Alexander II, was returning to the Winter Palace when something was hurled at his carriage.
My father led me up to the bed. "Papa," he said, "your sunshine is here." I saw the flicker of an eyelid. Grandfather's blue eyes opened and he tried to smile. He knew me.
The trauma of assassination was to haunt Nicky all his life. His father, now Alexander III, inherited the Russian Empire, and Nicholas became Tsarevich, the heir apparent. He would be taught the foundation stones of the Romanov faith: orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. More simply, the Church, the Tsar, and Russia. Ordinary Russians, the vast majority of the population, saw the Tsar, including Nicholas later in his life, as only one step away from God himself.
At home, we had icons and a portrait of the Tsar. The Tsar was like God on earth, and icons, God in heaven. We prayed to the Tsar and to God. Our whole family did that.
The Romanovs were an illustrious line which had ruled Russia since 1613. Peter the Great had founded the magnificent city of St. Petersburg in 1703 to be a window on the West. Another Romanov, Catherine the Great, had taken the dynasty to new heights of glory which rivaled those of any European clan. The Romanovs were the most extravagant rulers in the Western world, though they paid for the upkeep of their palaces and staff out of their own pocket. But that pocket was wide and deep. The Romanov Empire comprised 1/6 of the globe. Russia was a nation of extremes, vastly diverse in race, religion, and wealth. From the bottom of the social pyramid, the poor looked up at the rich, who made no excuses for their privileges. At the apex of it all, Nicholas Romanov grew up in luxury and unlimited privilege. His life was almost that of a playboy. During the social season, from New Year to Lent, he attended as many as 20 glamorous events a month. In July 1891, Nicholas visited the Siberian town of Tobolsk. He admired the bell of the Kremlin's cathedral and was entertained at the governor's house. 26 years later, Nicholas would spend many months in the same house, deposed and a prisoner. For generations, men like the governor of Tobolsk had oiled the wheels of the Tsarist system. In turn, the Tsars had always supported Russia's elite. But as the end of the 19th century neared, frustration and resentment at the iron rule were brewing in some of the younger members of the population. One of these disaffected young men was named Alexander Ulyanov. He was condemned to Schlüsselburg prison outside St. Petersburg for his attempted assassination of Tsar Alexander, Nicholas's father. In 1887, Ulyanov was hanged. He had grown up 2,000 miles away from the capital, in the town of Simbirsk. The high school he attended was fertile ground for budding young revolutionaries. The headmaster's son was Alexander Kerensky, who would play a key role in the still distant revolution. Ultimately, neither Alexander Kerensky nor Alexander Ulyanov were the most famous of Simbirsk High School's revolutionaries. Ulyanov had a younger brother who had impressed the headmaster.
Very gifted, always neat and assiduous, Ulyanov received the gold medal as the most deserving pupil. Religion and discipline were the basis of his upbringing.
This young man would become known to Russia and the world as Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. In 1891, the collision of Nicholas and Lenin was still years away. The Romanov dynasty was firmly entrenched, and in their 900-room Gatchina palace, the 21-year-old future Tsar, Nicholas II, was a young man in love.
My dream one day is to marry Alex H. I have loved her a long while. Am nearly convinced our feelings are mutual.
Alex H. was a shy German princess named Alex Victoria Helena Louise Beatrice von Hesse-Darmstadt, but known to her family as Sunny. In 1884, 12-year-old Alex had met 16-year-old Nicky at the wedding of her sister Ella to Nicky's uncle Sergei. Though it was love at first sight, it was a decade before Nicky got a chance to pop the question. They were in Germany, where much of Europe's closely related royalty, including Alex's grandmother, Queen Victoria, had gathered for yet another wedding.
For 10 years, Nicholas was waiting for the right moment to make his official proposal to Alex. On the 8th of April, he draws 3 thick lines under the date. The dream he had cherished for 10 years had come true.
A marvelous, unforgettable day in my life, the day of my engagement to my precious, beloved Alex. Walked around the entire day in a haze, not fully conscious, actually, of what happened to me.
But they were not together for long. She leaves for England, he returns to Russia. And from then on, letters, letters without end. They wrote to each other every day. Here are Alexandra's letters. They're full of love, full of sweet, affectionate words. They call each other by tender little nicknames.
For my darling Nicky dear, from his deeply loving and devoted old owl.
Again and again, the same old face, Nicky.
Alex was 22 years old when she became engaged to the next Tsar of Russia. Her mother had died when she was only 6, and Alex became a regular visitor to England, where she was taught to be a proper Victorian by her grandmother, Queen Victoria herself. A combination of naivete and a sense of entitlement made Alex believe she could overcome any obstacles. But her primness and lack of humor did not go over well with the sophisticated Russian court.
Alix was not Queen Victoria's granddaughter for nothing. In fact, she was Queen Victoria's favourite granddaughter. And she had the attitudes you would expect. When she became empress, she tried to set up little knitting circles in the Winter Palace. And the Russian great ladies were not very amused by this. Petersburg high society was cultured, very elegant, and pretty loose living. And they regarded this rather shy, prim, almost sort of little daughter of an English rectory as beneath their contempt in many ways.
Later that same year, at the Imperial Summer Palace at Livadia, Tsar Alexander fell unexpectedly ill. In October, at the age of 49, he died. His 26-year-old son, Nicholas, was now Tsar of Russia. Nicholas's younger sister, Grand Duchess Olga, was one of the Romanov family assembled at the deathbed.
Nicky was in despair. He kept saying that he did not know what would become of us all, that he was wholly unfit to reign. And yet, Nicky's unfitness was by no means his fault. He should have been taught statesmanship, and he was not.
Nicky's brother-in-law, the Grand Duke, known as Sandro, also remembered the young Tsar's desperation.
Nicky asked me, "Sandro, what am I going to do? What is going to happen to me, to you, to Alex, to Mother, to Russia? I'm not ready to be Tsar. I never wanted to become one."
The day after Alexander died, the family gathered to mourn in a small private chapel at Livadia. Today it is open to the public, and one of the few remnants left of Tsarist glory. Still, it is a far cry from the day when Alex arrived here from Germany to be with Nicholas. Her reluctant conversion to Russian Orthodoxy, a prerequisite to becoming Tsarina, was finally arranged. During this tumultuous period, it was Nicholas's one consolation.
In our deep sadness, the Lord gives us quiet, luminous joy. At 10, my Alex was consecrated.
And so, within 24 hours, Nicholas became Tsar Nicholas II, and Alex became officially his intended. A few weeks later, with relatively little ceremony, they were married. The young bride wrote to her sister,
Our wedding seemed to me a mere continuation of the funeral liturgy for the dead Tsar, with this one difference. Now, I wore a white dress instead of a black one.
Nicholas and Alexandra chose the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, Tsar's village, outside St. Petersburg as their new home. Within 3 months, Alex was pregnant. In the fall of 1895, she gave birth to a girl, Olga. If a daughter was a disappointment for the Tsar and Tsarina, they never expressed it. There was plenty of time for a son and heir. Their immediate preoccupation was the coronation ceremony, over a year in the planning and set for May 1896 in Moscow. It was recorded in a special album, now a rare collector's item. The procession of the entire Romanov family, all their relatives, the kings and queens of other European nations, wound its way through the great halls of the Kremlin. As Nicholas and Alexandra descended the red staircase, they were captured on film, the first ever shot of a state occasion 100 years ago. The festivities lasted a whole week. 4 days after the coronation itself, the Tsar's munificence as Little Father was to be demonstrated to all with gifts of enameled mugs, food, and drink. On the 18th of May, 500,000 Russians from all over the land gathered at the chosen spot. Then something went wrong, which was to haunt Nicholas forever.
The crowd that spent the night on Khodinka fields waiting for the food and mugs began to press on the structures, and there was a terrible crush. I have to record, with great sadness, that about 1,300 people were trampled.
The catastrophe, commemorated in a Moscow cemetery, was in no way Nicholas's fault. But he, as the new Tsar, carried the blame for the terrible events of the 18th of May, 1896. And in the eyes of many Russians, his wife Alexandra was faring little better. Over the next 5 years, Alexandra would bear 3 more children. After Olga came Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. But still no boy, and so no heir to the Romanov throne. As the new century began, St. Petersburg still appeared peaceful, but radicals like Alexander Kerensky, now a student in the capital, were circling ever closer.
It was Easter, and I was returning late at night, or rather in the morning, about 4 a.m., from the traditional midnight celebrations. I was walking home past the Winter Palace. Suddenly, I stopped involuntarily. On an overhanging balcony stood the young emperor, quite alone, deep in thought. A keen presentiment struck me. We should meet sometime. Somehow our paths would cross.
Years later, it was Kerensky who had the Romanovs arrested and sent the family into exile. But he paled in comparison to that other revolutionary from his hometown. By the turn of the century, Lenin had been sent by the Tsarist government into exile, where he continued to publish his magazine, Iskra, the Spark. His fury at the Romanov rule was already in full force.
Lenin revealed his attitude to the Tsar's family quite early on. In 1903, the abolition of capital punishment was discussed at the Second Congress. And there was a voice from the audience. You mean that this relates to the Tsar too? We won't shoot him? Lenin was also present there, and together they passed a decision that it couldn't be like this. The Tsar must be shot. So from the very beginning, the Bolsheviks had this idea that the Tsar must be shot.
But the final days of the Romanov family were still years away. While Lenin railed against Nicholas and all that he represented, the Tsar was unimpressed with Lenin or his newly formed Bolshevik party. A recluse by nature, Alexandra became increasingly alienated from Russian society and obsessed with her family. At last, at Peterhof Palace, outside St. Petersburg, the Empress gave the Tsar what he most wanted. It was 4 years into the new century, and almost 10 since Nicholas and Alexandra were married.
July 30th. For us, an unforgettable day on which God's goodness was so clearly visited upon us. At 1:15 this afternoon, Alex gave birth to a son, whom in prayer we named Alexei.
Soon, though, Nicholas's elation turned to ashes.
8th of September. Alex and I have been much worried. A hemorrhage began this morning without the slightest cause from the navel of our small Alexei.
It was hemophilia, inherited from the baby's great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, and carried by Alexandra. In those days, sufferers seldom reached adulthood. On top of the family tragedy came political unrest. On what became known as Bloody Sunday, the 9th of January, 1905, a march of loyal but disgruntled workers set out for the Winter Palace to hand a petition to the Tsar. Such a demonstration was unprecedented in the Russia of the Romanovs. Despite the peaceful intentions of the marchers, the authorities panicked. To back up the Cossacks with their whips, they called out the infantry with their rifles. Several hundred were killed.
9th of January. A distressing day. The troops have been forced to fire in several parts of the city, and there are many killed and wounded. Lord, how painful and sad this is.
But the damage was done.
Now that you've seen Last of the Tsars, A Dynasty in Decline, Part 1, talk about this. The documentary explains that the foundations of the Romanov faith were orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Discuss what this means and how it might have helped to keep the Tsarist system of government in place for so long. Now try this. Choose an event that took place in Russia during Nicholas's reign. Then, write a diary entry or letter about this event from the perspective of one of the Romanovs. Make sure your writing reflects history accurately. Log on to discoveryschool.com for curriculum materials and resources to support Last of the Tsars, A Dynasty in Decline. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests A Lifelong Passion, Nicholas and Alexandra, edited by Sergei Mironenko. Consider this before viewing Last of the Tsars, A Dynasty in Decline, Part 2. During Nicholas's rule, the Duma was created as a parliamentary system. What do you already know about this system of government? As you watch the documentary, pay attention to the relationship between Tsar Nicholas II and the Duma. Assignment Discovery now presents Last of the Tsars, A Dynasty in Decline, Part 2.
In 1904, Nicholas had been drawn into a disastrous war with Japan. He dispatched his troops with his blessing, not that they knew where they were going or why. The Russian people believed the propaganda, which promised a short, sharp, victorious war. But the Japanese people believed their propaganda, which promised the same and proved to be right. It took the Russian Navy's Baltic fleet 6 months on the high seas to make the engagement, only to be sunk in a single day at the Battle of Tsushima. The Tsar's reputation, too, was sinking. The Tsar's enemies spread rumors reporting his cool response when told the news of the Tsushima disaster.
Anyone for another set?
But the family remember it differently, as Nicholas's sister Olga noted.
I was at the palace when the telegram arrived. Both Alex and I were with Nicky. He turned ashen pale. Alex broke down and sobbed. The whole palace was plunged into mourning that day.
In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in the summer of 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt hosted peace talks between Russia and Japan. The warring nations were financially exhausted by the conflict and desperate to find peace. In the end, the U.S. brokered a face-saving deal, with each giving the other territory. Peace abroad had come, at a price. Peace at home would prove even more costly. In St. Petersburg, factories were closing every day. By October, there was a general strike. The attempted revolution of 1905 was underway, though it would not succeed. The authorities called on the troops, which only strengthened the strikers' determination and the radicals' demands. The Tsar's empire balanced on a knife edge.
The emperor was really faced with an alternative, either to try and smash the opposition by the use of massive military force, or to make concessions to try and win back the moderates. He decided to try and win back the moderates because he felt that even if he did smash the opposition now, by using the army, it would be no permanent solution.
A turning point came when the Tsar's own uncle, the army boss Grand Duke Nikolai, came out in support of a change from the Tsarist system to a constitutional monarchy. Nicholas believed that granting a constitution was an abomination and would destroy the Russian Empire. But he had no alternative. Nicholas bowed to fate. It was here in the grand ballroom at Peterhof Palace that Nicholas signed away his sacred inheritance. He would still be Tsar, but no longer the absolute autocrat.
17th of October. Invoking God's help, I signed. My only consolation is that such is the will of God, and that this grave decision will lead my dear Russia out of the intolerable chaos she has been in for nearly a year.
Reluctantly creating the first ever elected Russian parliament, or Duma, Nicholas believed he had bought time. But the taste of freedom promised by the Constitution only intensified the appetite of the radicals. At the beginning of 1906, Nicholas wrote to his mother.
My own dear Mamma, how shameful it is to live through such a crisis in the eyes of the whole world. But this is God's will, and I must endure all troubles until the very end.
Russia's hopes for stability lay in the constitution which Nicky so detested, and the parliament it created. In April 1906, the Tsar and Tsarina came to the Winter Palace for the ceremonial opening of the First Duma. The procession wound its way up the formal Rastrelli staircase and entered the Hall of St. George, where the humbled Nicholas forced himself to speak.
May my fervent hopes be fulfilled, to see my people happy and to bequeath to my son a stronger, better, and more enlightened state.
Until now, there had been no legal political parties in Russia. The Duma, with its elected representatives from a spectrum of new parties, marked an irreversible step in Russian political life. The alliance between Nicholas and the Duma was uneasy at best. Whenever he felt the demands of the deputies went too far, he dissolved the Duma, only to reconvene a new, more obedient one. Hiding behind the smokescreen of the Duma and the Constitution, Nicholas and his ministers now set about stamping out radical political opposition. In the midst of Russia's chaos, the Grand Duchesses were growing up, though they took second place to the younger Alexei, who was the heir apparent. He always followed close behind his father, while his 4 older sisters brought up the rear. The Grand Duchesses could not, by law, inherit the throne. In the family, they were known collectively by the initial letters of their names: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Otma. Olga was by temperament closest to her father, honest and well-intentioned. But it was Tatiana who could wind Nicky round her little finger. Her sisters called her the governess. Maria was the most traditional, flirtatious, affectionate, and fond of children. Anastasia was impish and charming, always playing the fool. And young Alexei was the family's darling, and so it had to be admitted, just a little spoiled. In August 1912, the imperial regime seemed to have recovered its former glory as Russia rejoiced in the centennial celebrations of the victory over Napoleon. It was a time of peace and prosperity. Industrial production was rising, harvests were bountiful, and modernization and new technology were reaching out to all corners of the empire. But there was no scientific breakthrough in the one area that mattered most to the Tsar and Tsarina: medicine. Nicholas and Alexandra's desperate concern for their son's well-being was to dominate their thoughts and shape their destiny. The first clue that a savior for the little boy might have come can be found in Nicholas's diary.
November the 1st, 1905. We have got to know a man of God, Gregory, from Tobolsk province.
When Gregory Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg, his reputation as a mystical faith healer had preceded him. For Nicholas and Alexandra, Rasputin symbolized the simple soul of the starets, the holy man of Russian folk tradition. They believed that God had at last answered their prayers. Rasputin was to worm his way into the hearts of the imperial family. From an early age, Alexandra had wanted her son to lead as normal a life as possible. A sailor named Derivenko was assigned to protect the fragile Alexei. He was the young boy's constant companion, but by necessity he was also something of a warden. It was a constant struggle to provide Alexei with a normal, happy childhood and still keep him alive. As Alexei grew up, severe bruising and hemorrhaging continued to appear without warning, often threatening his life. The doctors were at a loss. In May of 1905, Gregory Rasputin arrived at Alexei's bedside and uttered a few soothing words. To everyone's amazement, bleeding in the suffering young Tsarevich stopped. To the Empress, it was a miracle. She was blind to Rasputin's public image of depravity and deceit. As Rasputin elbowed his way up the social ladder, photographs found their way into the newspapers with captions full of suggestive innuendo. Romancing the Romanovs. In the family circle.
My grandfather didn't like Rasputin at all. He knew all about him. He studied his life. He had means to study. And he considered him as the evil spirit. Of course, Rasputin was an impostor, a tragic figure. He never was a monk, but he sometimes pretended to be one.
The imperial couple hid their fears about the heir in a public display of official engagements. Outside their closest circles, the nature of Alexei's illness was not known. The strain of keeping up appearances took its toll on Nicholas and Alexandra. Whenever they could, they took pleasure in normal family life, far away from the formalities of the court. Even when he wore the black armband of court mourning, Nicholas loved horsing around when off duty. The Tsar loved photography and took pictures of his adored family at every opportunity. In the fall of 1912, the imperial family gathered at Spala, a hunting retreat in Poland. It was a place meant for enjoying outdoor pursuits, and all the family participated, except for Alexei. He had to be content with gentle boat trips on a nearby lake. One day, while climbing into the boat, he tripped and fell. The doctors who rushed in from St. Petersburg pronounced the case hopeless. Rasputin was far away in Siberia. Nicholas, as so often in moments of despair, wrote to his mother.
The days between October the 6th and the 10th were the worst. The poor darling suffered intensely. The pains came in spasms and recurred every quarter of an hour. I was hardly able to stay in the room, but of course had to take turns with Alex, for she was exhausted by spending whole nights by his bed.
For the first time since Alexei's birth, public bulletins were issued admitting that the heir to the throne was seriously ill. Desperate, the Empress gave instructions for a telegram to be wired to Rasputin. His reply came by return from Siberia.
God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much.
Within a day of the telegram's arrival, the hemorrhage stopped. For the Empress, it was simple. A miracle had been worked. Spala was to prove a dramatic turning point. From now on, Rasputin's power over the Empress was to grow unchecked. In February 1913, despite the now limited powers of the Tsar, the Romanovs were grandly celebrating 300 years of their dynasty. They made a pilgrimage through the empire, arriving in Moscow in May. Despite all the splendor, the Romanov dynasty was troubled. Public discontent bubbled beneath the surface, and now a new weakness appeared in the royal family. Newsreels had come into vogue, and in them, the young Alexei could be seen, obviously ill and being carried everywhere. The invincible Romanovs were vulnerable after all. On the 28th of June, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo by Serbian nationalists. The Germany of Kaiser William II saw in this the opportunity it had been seeking to expand its empire. When the Austrians appealed for support in a retaliation against Serbia, Germany agreed. The Germans anticipated that the Russian Tsar might well come to the assistance of his Slav brothers, the Serbs. This would give Germany the pretext it needed to declare war on Russia. But the Kaiser was the first cousin of the German-born Russian Empress, Alexandra. In the close-knit world of European royalty, Willie, as he was known in the family, was also a distant cousin of Nicholas. But blood counted for little when empires were on the march. Willie and Nicky were soon to find themselves on opposite sides of the divide. And the Russian people would come to see their Tsar's beloved Empress as an interloper, a German spy, and the source of all the country's misfortunes. News of Germany's declaration of war on Russia reached Nicholas at home in the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. Alexandra began to weep as her confidant Isa Buxhoveden remembered.
She was the Empress of Russia, Russian always in heart and soul. Once during the war she said to me, "It is the country of my husband and my son. I love this country with all my heart."
Word of of the war spread like wildfire. Russia appeared to rally to the cause, and even to her Tsar.
People were carrying the Tsar's portrait and crosses. Reserve soldiers took their uniforms out of mothballs, put them on, and were singing "God Save the Tsar." This was our official anthem.
At this point, a telegram arrived from Rasputin in Siberia.
Let Papa not plan for war, for with war will come the end of Russia and yourselves. You will lose to the last man.
The Tsar read it, tore it into shreds, and gave the order for general mobilization. The revolutionary members of the Duma stood clearly against the war. They staged a walkout and were promptly charged with treason and imprisoned. Meanwhile, the modern and well-equipped German army was feeling lucky. Paris for lunch and St. Petersburg for dinner was the confident Kaiser's cry. The capital, St. Petersburg, was renamed Petrograd in a spirit of Slavic unity. News from the front began to drift in. A Russian victory against the Austrians was offset by crushing losses at the hands of the Germans. And, as always, war brought misery, fear, and tragedy.